I felt suddenly so discouraged by the humiliation of this reward that I almost flung it back in her face. Just in time I remembered my good resolutions and forced myself to remain calm. I took the sugar, bowed, and munched it with as intelligent an air as possible. Such was my first encounter with Zira. She was head of the department of the institution to which I had been brought. She had a long conversation with the guerrilla warders, and I fancied she was giving them instructions about me. Then she continued on her rounds, inspecting the other occupants of the cages. The following day, 2 figures came down the passage, Zira, the female chimpanzee, and another monkey who was plainly in a high position. He was an orang-utang, the first I had seen on the planet Soro. He was less tall than the gorillas and slightly round-shouldered. His head adorned with long, coarse hair, his face frozen in an expression of pedantic meditation. He looked like a venerable and solemn old pontiff. He was also dressed quite differently from the others, in a long black frock coat with a red star in the buttonhole, and black and white striped trousers, both somewhat dusty. Their arrival gave me an opportunity of noting again the sense of hierarchy which seemed to exist among the monkeys. Zira showed every sign of respect for this superior of hers. The 2 gorillas went forward to meet him as soon as they caught sight of him, and bowed low. The orang-utan gave a little condescending wave of his hand. He made straight for my cage. I welcomed the great authority with my most affable smile and addressed him in ringing tones. "My dear orang-utan, how happy I am to find myself at last in the presence of a creature who exhales wisdom and intelligence. I am sure we are going to understand each other, you and I." The dear old thing had given a start at the sound of my voice. He scratched his ear for some time and peered suspiciously into my cage as though scenting some trickery. Zira then addressed him, notebook in hand, reading out the particulars she had jotted down about me. She did her best, but it was plain to see that the orang-utang refused to be convinced. He uttered 2 or 3 sentences in a pompous manner, shrugged his shoulders several times, and started pacing up and down, passing and repassing in front of my cage, and darting glances in my direction that were far from benevolent. The other monkeys waited for his decision in respectful silence. I felt annoyed at his attitude towards me, and started pacing to and fro in my cage, imitating his gait, my shoulders hunched, my hands behind my back, my brow wrinkled in an air of profound meditation. The gorillas choked with laughter, and Zira herself was unable to keep a straight face. I was congratulating myself on my demonstration until I realized it was dangerous. Noticing my mimicry, the orang-utan looked extremely vexed and in a dry voice uttered a few sharp words which immediately restored order. But I had had enough of his blindness and resolved to give him fresh proof of my capabilities. Stretching my arms out towards him, I spoke up to the best of my ability. "Me, Zaius." I had noticed that all the subalterns who addressed him began with these 2 words. Zaius, I subsequently learnt, was the pontiff's name. Me, an honorific title. The monkeys were flabbergasted. They no longer wanted to laugh, least of all Zira, who seemed extremely perturbed, above all when I pointed a finger at her and added Zira, a name which I had likewise remembered and which could only be hers. As for Zaius, he was all in a fluster and started pacing up and down the corridor, shaking his head with an incredulous air. Zira looked at me with a singular intensity, and her white muzzle turned pink, which, as I later learned, is a sign of emotion in chimpanzees. But there was nothing I could do to convince the orang-utan. This diabolical monkey started shrugging his shoulders, shaking his head energetically when Zira spoke to him, and then gave some decisive orders. The 2 gorillas, Zoram and Zanam, opened my cage, took Nova away, and brought me back instead an elderly matron. Worse was to come, however. In anguish, I watched my friend Nova being bundled off and was horrified to see her put into the cage directly opposite, delivered to a man with hefty shoulders, a hairy-chested colossus who started dancing round her, embarking with a frenzied ardour in a curious love display, a sort of slow, hesitant dance consisting of steps forward, backwards, and sideways. He moved thus in an ever-decreasing circle, a circle whose centre was occupied by Nova. As soon as I saw what this brute was up to, I forgot my good resolutions. I screamed and yelled in the manner of the men of Soror. I showed my fury as they did by hurling myself against the bars, biting them, foaming at the mouth, grinding my teeth, behaving in short in a thoroughly bestial manner. Seeing me behave like this, Zaius smiled. It was the first mark of benevolence he had bestowed on me. He had at last perceived in me human behavior and had found himself on familiar ground. His theory had prevailed. This put him in such a good mood that he even consented, at a remark from Zira, to cancel his orders and give me one last chance. The dreadful old matron was led away, and Nova was restored to me before the hefty brute had touched her. The group of monkeys then stood back, and all three of them started observing me closely from a distance. What more can I say? These emotions had broken down my resistance. I felt I should never be able to bear the sight of my nymph at the mercy of another man. I resigned myself like a coward to the victory of the orang-utan, who was now smiling with pleasure at his astuteness. Hesitantly, I attempted a step of the dance. Yes, I, the ultimate achievement of millenary evolution, in front of an old orang-utan, in front of a female chimpanzee smiling with self-satisfaction, in front of a couple of chuckling gorillas, I, Ulysse Meru, embarked like a peacock round the gorgeous Nova, on the love display. I must now admit that I adapted with remarkable ease to life in my cage. During the day, the monkeys attended to my every need. At night, I shared my litter with one of the loveliest girls in the cosmos. I grew so accustomed to this situation that for more than a month I made no attempt to put an end to it. One day, however, I felt nauseated and blushed at my cowardly resignation. What would Professor Ontel think if he found me in this state? I forthwith made up my mind to behave like a civilized man. While stroking Zira's arm as a gesture of thanks for a sugar lump, I snatched her notebook and pen, sat down on the straw and sketched the system of Betelgeuse, marking Soror down in its exact position. The effect it had on Zira was extraordinary. Her muzzle turned purple, and she gave a sharp exclamation. Then, in another corner of the sheet, I drew out our dear old solar system with its principal planets. I indicated the Earth and pointed my finger at my own chest. She was flabbergasted and about to draw closer when Zaius appeared at the end of the corridor. Terrified, she quickly crumpled the paper, put her notebook into her pocket, and raised her forefinger to her lips with an air of entreaty. I obeyed her and promptly resumed my intelligent animal attitude. From then on, thanks to Zira, my knowledge of the simian world made rapid progress. She contrived to see me alone every day, instructing me in the simian language, while learning French with amazing rapidity. In less than 2 months, we were capable of holding a conversation on a variety of subjects. I don't think you realize the danger you are in here on Soror. We were strolling through the park. Zira had consented to this only after much hesitation. It had taken some time for me to convince her of my origin, but she had now begun to work out a plan to liberate me. Meanwhile, my heart was thumping at being in the open air again, albeit naked and on the end of a collar and lead. Zira apologized for this, explaining that even though there were a few tame men who could be taken out without causing a scene, it was more normal if I were on a leash. "Now listen," said Zira. "Your launch has been discovered. Our researchers realize it was not manufactured here." "What about our spaceship, which has been in orbit around Soror for the last 2 months?" "I haven't heard anything. It must have escaped the notice of our astronomers." "But you must tell them, Zira," I cried. "Why are you hiding me away? Why not reveal the truth to everyone?"